On April 17, 1940, in a sealed laboratory at the Temmler-Werk pharmaceutical factory in the Berlin Johannisthal district, chemist Fritz Hauschild signed off on the latest production run of a methamphetamine compound marketed under the brand name Pervitin. The chemical smell of the production floor hung in the air. The small round tin packaging stamped with the Temmler logo moved down the line in batches of 33 milligrams to a tablet, the cardboard cylinders stacked for shipment east toward the Army depots and west toward the assembly areas of Army Group A. The conventional account of what happened in the next 60 days is well known. The Wehrmacht crossed the Ardennes. Heinz Guderian's Panzer Corps reached the Meuse at Sedan in 72 hours. France collapsed. The story is told as a triumph of doctrine, of operational tempo, of one general's tactical genius. The story is also incomplete. The Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv at Freiburg holds, in its RH-12-23 series, the medical service files of the Wehrmacht for the spring of 1940. The files record an order of 35 million Pervitin tablets between April and July of that year, dispatched to the Army and the Luftwaffe, documented in the reconstruction by Norman Ohler in 2015. Otto F. Ranke, director of the Research Institute for Defense Physiology at the Berlin Military Medical Academy, had run his trial on 90 students in late 1939. The compound would not be classified as a regulated substance until July 1941. Sedan, May 13, 1940. Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps crossed the Meuse after 72 hours of continuous movement. Ranke's diary entry from March 1940 set the dosage protocol: 2 tablets per soldier, repeatable. Heinrich Böll, the future Nobel laureate, then a Wehrmacht private in occupied Poland, had already written home on November 9, 1939, requesting the same tablets from his family. The letter is held at the Heinrich Böll Archive in Cologne. What one Berlin physician would later describe as the chemical infrastructure of a war machine that, by the spring of 1940, no longer slept, and the order Otto Ranke filed with the Wehrmacht High Command on April 17, 1940. That is the day the cardboard tins began moving by the millions toward the front. Temmler-Werke, the Berlin factory that made a regime feel invincible. Fritz Hauschild was a chemist of unremarkable ambition. He worked in 1937 at a small pharmaceutical company in the southeast of Berlin called Temmler-Werk, and the molecule he was about to patent would, within 3 years, be issued by the carton to half the German army. The patent covered the synthesis of N-methylamphetamine. The dose was 3 milligrams. The brand name was Pervitin. The product reached German pharmacies in 1938 without prescription and stayed available without prescription until the middle of 1941. Albert Mendel, the company's marketing director, ran the campaign. The advertising copy promised wakefulness, energy, the elimination of fatigue. It worked. Civilian sales rose through 1939. Office workers carried the tin in a coat pocket. Long-distance drivers carried it in the glove compartment. The compound entered the bloodstream of the country before it ever entered a soldier's pack. Then the Wehrmacht noticed. Otto Ranke was a physiologist. He directed the Research Institute for Defense Physiology at the Berlin Military Medical Academy on the Invalidenstrasse, and his question in late 1939 was operational. Could a soldier be kept awake for 48, 72, 96 hours without a measurable collapse in performance? Ranke ordered Pervitin from the Temmler factory and ran the trial on 90 medical students. The result, recorded in his own notes, was 8 hours of sustained wakefulness on a single dose, repeatable. He recommended the compound for combat use. He filed the recommendation with the Army Medical Inspectorate. The Inspectorate forwarded it. The procurement order followed. Here is the part that ought to be in every account of the May 1940 campaign and is not. The 35 million tablet order is documented. The file is open. It has been open for decades. The Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv at Freiburg digitized portions of the RH-12-23 series years ago. Norman Ohler reconstructed the procurement chain in his 2015 monograph Der totale Rausch, translated into English in 2016 as Blitzed. The German historian Hans Mommsen reviewed the manuscript before publication and confirmed the archival reconstruction. Peter Steinkamp, a German military medical historian, had published peer-reviewed work on Wehrmacht pharmacology before Ohler's book ever appeared. The record exists. It existed in 1945. It existed in 1985. It existed in 2005. Every popular account of Sedan that omits it omits a documented variable, not a speculative one. Theodor Morell, a Berlin Society dermatologist, was, by 1937, treating a single patient with daily injections. The patient's name will return in this story. For now, he is a footnote on the edge of the chemical record. The compound, by April 1940, was moving by the carton toward the assembly areas. Ranke filed the order anyway. The trials would continue, in a sense. Only the laboratory this time would be a forest in eastern France. Sedan, the Meuse crossing, fueled by 35 million tablets. In the spring of 1940, the German army was about to attempt something its own general staff had, only months earlier, considered operationally reckless. The crossing of the Ardennes by armored divisions in continuous movement without the usual halts for rest. The 35 million tablets ordered between April and July are documented in BARECH-MARH 12-23. The dosage protocol set by Ranke called for 2 tablets at the start of an operation, repeatable every 4 hours. The compound entered the supply chain alongside ammunition, fuel, and rations. It was distributed by the medical companies. The carton moved with the Panzer. Heinz Guderian commanded 19th Panzer Corps. His memoir, Erinnerungen eines Soldaten, published in 1951, frames the 72 hours from the Luxembourg border to the Meuse as a triumph of doctrine. The memoir is self-serving. It is not a primary medical document. The primary medical document is in Freiburg. The 72-hour push, May 10th to May 13th, 1940, took place across roads that the French General Staff had ruled impassable for armor. The columns moved without halting. The tank crews stayed at their stations. The drivers did not sleep. Erwin Rommel, commanding the 7th Panzer Division further north, covered 350 kilometers in a single stretch. The division earned the nickname Gespenster Division, the Ghost Division, because French units could not place it on a map. The chemical variable is not the only explanation for the speed, it is one of the documented variables. Heinrich Böll's letters home, between November 1939 and May 1940, repeat the request. He writes for tablets. He writes that the supply at the front is not always reliable. He writes from occupied Poland, then from the Western Front. The letters are held at the Heinrich Böll Archive in Cologne. They are not the testimony of a senior officer. They are the testimony of a private soldier, the lowest rank in the German army, who would, 23 years later, win the Nobel Prize for Literature for novels about German conscience. In 1939, he asked his family to mail him Pervitin. The Luftwaffe ran a parallel program. Bomber crews on long missions received a chocolate variant, Hildebrand Schoker Cola, laced with the same compound, distributed alongside the standard ration. Pilots returning from sorties over the Channel reported sustained alertness on flights that should have ended in collapse. The compound did not eliminate fatigue, it postponed the recognition of fatigue. The distinction would matter. On June 22, 1940, in the railway carriage at Compiègne, the same carriage in which the German delegation had signed the armistice in November 1918, France formally surrendered. The campaign was over. The triumph was complete. The newsreels showed the marching columns and the empty roads. They did not show what the Wehrmacht Medical Service was beginning to record in its files for the months that followed. The mortality reports for May, June, July, and August 1940 contain entries that do not fit the standard categories. Cardiac collapse in soldiers under 30, acute psychotic episodes in tank crewmen, sustained insomnia syndromes that did not resolve when the campaign ended. The named field physicians, research has identified them in the medical service files at Freiburg, began submitting case reports up the chain. The reports went to Ranke. Ranke, the man who had filed the procurement order in April, was now reading the consequences of his own work in June. What the frontline physicians began recording in late June was not victory, it was a pattern. How the Reich's own physicians lost control of the compound. On July 1, 1941, the Reich health leader Leonardo Conti placed Pervitin under the Reich opium law, classifying the compound as a regulated substance. The order was, in operational terms, 14 months too late. The text of the regulation appears in the Reich's Gesundheitsblatt, the official health bulletin of the Reich, and the document can still be retrieved at the Bundesarchiv Berlin-Lichterfelde. Conti held the title of Reichsgesundheitsführer. He had received warnings from the Wehrmacht medical service since the autumn of 1940. He had received warnings from civilian physicians treating dependency syndromes in factory workers. He had, by his own correspondence, understood the scale of distribution. The regulation, when it came, did not retroactively recall the cartons already in the field. It did not set up an enforcement mechanism for army medical companies. It did not address the chocolate variant in the Luftwaffe ration packs. It changed the legal status of the compound on paper. The supply chain continued. The cases recorded in the medical service files between summer 1940 and the regulation in 1941 fall into three categories. The first is cardiac collapse in soldiers under 30. Recorded across multiple field hospital reports, attributed by the attending physicians to sustained stimulant use during the May campaign and the months that followed. The second is acute psychotic episode, soldiers presenting with paranoia, hallucination, and disordered speech, in some cases requiring removal from frontline duty. The third is dependency. Soldiers who had been issued the tablets in April and May 1940 were by the autumn requesting them as a matter of routine. The supply could no longer be characterized as operational, it had become structural. Otto Ranke, by the late autumn of 1940, had written internal memoranda warning the Army Medical Inspectorate about the trajectory of distribution. He did not retract his original recommendation. He argued for tighter controls. He argued for restricted distribution to specific operations rather than open supply. The memoranda survive in his personal papers, partially digitized at the Berlin Military Medical Academy archive. They were read, they were filed. The supply continued. Then came June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa opened along a front of more than 2,000 kilometers. 3 million German and Axis soldiers crossed into Soviet territory in the largest land offensive in recorded military history. The medical companies of the invading armies carried the compound with them. The regulation under the Reich opium law would not be enacted for another 9 days. By the time Conti's order took legal effect on July 1, 1941, the offensive was already deep into Lithuania, Belarus, and western Ukraine. The supply chain did not stop. It could not stop. The depots at the Army Group rear had been stocked in the spring. The medical companies had standing orders. The regulation arrived in Berlin while the cartons were already moving east. The pattern documented in 1940 repeated in 1941, but on a scale the medical service had not yet measured. The Eastern Front did not run on 72-hour campaigns. It ran on continuous operations across thousands of kilometers, in summer heat, in autumn mud, in winter cold that the German High Command had not provisioned for. The compound was issued through the summer advance. It was issued during the encirclements at Bialystok and Minsk in late June and early July. It was issued during the drive on Smolensk in August. It was issued during the encirclement of Kiev in September, in which more than 600,000 Soviet soldiers were taken prisoner. By October, the medical service files contain entries indicating that field physicians could no longer reliably track distribution at the company level. The cartons were arriving. The cartons were being opened. Whether the dosage protocol was being followed or whether soldiers were self-administering at intervals of their own choosing was no longer something the medical service could answer. The cases of cardiac collapse recorded in the Wehrmacht mortality reports for the second half of 1941 increased. So did the psychotic episodes. So did the documented dependency syndromes. Ernst Günther Schenk, an SS pharmacist who would later testify after the war, observed the distribution patterns in the rear area depots of the Eastern Front. His post-war testimony given to American interrogators, paraphrased in the captured records files at Nara, described a system in which the medical regulation existed on paper and the operational reality existed on the supply road. The compound was now regulated. Whether anyone in the chain of command intended to enforce that regulation, given what the Eastern Front was about to demand, was a different question entirely. It would not be answered in 1941. Theodor Morell, the personal physician, and his patient A. Theodor Morell was a Berlin Society dermatologist of middling reputation before 1936. He was overweight, sweated heavily, kept poor records of his other patients, and after 1936 became, by Hitler's personal selection, the only physician with daily access to the man making strategic decisions for a continent at war. The selection was not based on credentials. It was based on a single course of injections Morell had administered in 1936, after which the patient reported feeling restored. From that point forward, Morell traveled with the patient. He kept notebooks. He recorded each injection. The notebooks would survive the war and reach the United States in May 1945. The patient was logged in the notebooks as patient A. The entries begin in 1936 and run through April 1945. Across that span, Morell administered, by his own count, more than 800 separate injections. The substances numbered roughly 90. They included vitamins. They included hormone preparations. They included Eucodal, a brand name oxycodone preparation. They included methamphetamine compounds in the same chemical family as the tablets the Wehrmacht had been issuing since 1940. The escalation pattern visible in the 1944 entries, confirmed by the captured notebooks now held at the National Archives at College Park, Maryland, in Record Group 242, Captured German Records, shows a progression from occasional use to daily administration of multiple substances in combination. Morell did not appear to follow a coherent pharmacological plan. He administered what produced visible effect. The physical deterioration is documentable. Film footage from the Reich Chancellery Garden in February 1945 shows the patient unable to control the tremor in his left hand. The newsreels from 1939 had not shown that tremor. Adjutants who saw the patient in private settings and who testified after the war described stretches of dullness alternating with stretches of agitation. The dullness corresponded, in Morell's notebooks, to entries recording sedative compounds. The agitation corresponded to entries recording stimulants. The pattern was visible to the doctor, recorded in the doctor's own hand, and continued unchanged through the final winter of the war. Ernst Günther Schenk, the SS pharmacist, encountered Morell's pharmacy in the bunker in late April 1945. His post-war testimony, preserved in interrogation transcripts in American captured records files, described a stockpile of compounds the relevance of which a normal practice would not have explained. Schenk, a trained pharmacist, identified the inventory. The inventory matched the notebook entries. The strategic implication of the notebooks is the layer the post-war narrative could not absorb. The compound that had fueled the May 1940 advance was, in escalated and combined form, sustaining the central decision-maker through the campaign that destroyed him. The decisions of late 1944, the Ardennes offensive, the order to hold every meter of Reich territory, the refusal to authorize withdrawals on the Eastern Front, the orders relayed from the bunker to commanders who recognized them as detached from operational reality, were issued by a patient whose pharmacological record is preserved in the notebooks of his own physician. The connection is not speculative. The notebooks exist, the dates exist, the cross-reference to the operational record exists. Here is what the captured archive establishes and what the popular account did not, for decades, integrate. The Morel notebooks were captured in May 1945. They were summarized by American military intelligence interrogators in the summer of 1945. They were available in fragmentary form to scholars by the late 1940s. By the 1980s, they were fully accessible. And yet the story of the regime's collapse, the version told in the high school chapter, in the documentary voiceover, in the popular biography, remained a story of ideology and willpower. The chemical record was reduced to a footnote. The reduction was not the work of a conspiracy. It was the work of a simpler story exerting gravitational pull on a more complicated one. The simpler story was easier to tell. The simpler story was easier to remember. The simpler story was what the post-war consensus on both sides of the Iron Curtain preferred to inherit. Morel did not destroy the notebooks. He carried them out of Berlin in a leather case. Within weeks, they would be on a desk in a US Army interrogation room, and the question of what had been administered on which dates, in which quantities, to which patient, that question now had a paper trail. Bundesarchiv RH 12-23, the file that took 70 years to be read. In the reading room of the Bundesarchiv Militär Archiv in Freiburg, the medical service files of the Wehrmacht, series RH 12-23, sit on metal shelves that have been there since the 1960s. The file numbers have not changed, the contents have not changed, only who has bothered to read them has changed. The series was substantially open to scholars by the 1970s. Portions were digitized in the 2010s. The procurement records, the dosage protocols, the field physician reports, the mortality entries, all of it has been available under standard archival access procedures for the entirety of the post-war period during which the popular account of the May 1940 campaign was written, rewritten and consolidated into the version most viewers carry in their heads. The Morel notebooks are at the National Archives at College Park, Maryland in Record Group 242. They have been there since the late 1940s. The Heinrich Böll Archive at Cologne holds the soldiers' letters from 1939 and 1940, including the November 9, 1939 letter requesting Pervitin from his family, and has held them since the archive was established. The Reichsgesundheitsblatt issues that record Conti's July 1941 regulation are at the Bundesarchiv Berlin-Lichterfelde. None of these collections required a leak. None required a Freedom of Information request. None required the death of a witness or the declassification of a Cold War file. They were sitting on shelves. Peter Steinkamp, a German military medical historian, had published on Wehrmacht pharmacology before Norman Ohler began his research. Ola, a journalist and novelist by training, spent 3 years in the Bundesarchiv reading what specialist historians had already cited, but had never assembled into a single popular reconstruction. Der totale Rausch appeared in 2015. Hans Mommsen, one of the senior figures in 20th century German historiography, reviewed the manuscript before publication and confirmed the archival foundation. The English translation, Blitzkrieg, appeared in 2016. The book sold internationally. It triggered a wave of popular discussion. The reaction inside the academic community was more measured. Specialist historians had known the chemical layer for years and disagreed with Ola in places about the weight to assign it. But no one disputed the underlying archival record. The record was the record. Here is the structural fact that the origin-revelation twist of this story rests on. The granular reality is not in dispute among specialists. 35 million tablets between April and July 1940. Ranker's signed procurement protocol. Morell's 800-plus injection entries. Conti's July 1941 regulation. Boll's November 1939 letter. The cardiac collapse cases in the medical service files. The Eastern Front distribution failure. The captured notebooks at College Park. The series number at Freiburg. None of this is contested at the archival level. The record has not changed. What changed in 2015 was not the archive. It was a single researcher willing to spend 3 years reading what nobody had been paid to read, and willing to write the result for an audience that had not been given the chemical layer of the story. The compound itself did not vanish from the world after 1945. The molecule Hauschild, patented in 1937, remains in regulated medical form in modern pharmacology. Modern militaries, including the German Bundeswehr, the United States Air Force, and other allied services, operate regulated stimulant doctrines for sustained operations with medical oversight, dosage protocols, and prohibitions that the Wehrmacht did not impose on itself in 1940. The pharmacological reality the Wehrmacht discovered and lost control of became one of the inherited operational problems of every modern military medical service. The lesson was learned by the institutions that needed to learn it. It was not, for a long time, integrated into the popular memory of the war. The compound is regulated now in every army that has a medical doctrine. The file in Freiburg was always there. The story it tells was always there. What changed in 2015 was not the archive. It was a single researcher willing to spend 3 years reading what nobody had been paid to read. The Heinrich Böll Archive in Cologne holds, under glass, a letter dated November 9, 1939. The handwriting is that of a 21-year-old Wehrmacht private writing home from occupied Poland to his family. The letter contains, among other things, a request. The 4 words of the request are in the soldier's own hand, in standard German, in pencil. He asks his family to send him some Pervitin. The man who wrote those 4 words would, 23 years later, in 1972, accept the Nobel Prize for Literature in Stockholm for novels about German conscience, German guilt, and the unanswered weight that the war placed on the generation that had fought it. The boy in occupied Poland in November 1939 did not know what the regime had placed in his hand. He did not know that Otto Ranker had ordered the trial on 90 students that same autumn. He did not know that Fritz Hauschild had patented the molecule 2 years earlier in a Berlin factory. He did not know that the file recording the procurement of 35 million tablets was about to enter a series the Bundesarchiv would catalogue as RH12-23. He knew only that the tablet worked and that the supply at the front was sometimes thin and that his family in Cologne could mail him more. The verdict on what the regime did is not in the narration of the historian. It is in the file number at Freiburg. It is in the date on the letter under glass. It is in the 4 words written in pencil by Heinrich Böll. This content is for educational and historical reflection purposes only. For academic citation, please consult the primary archival sources referenced.